All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to the conversation. We're joined today by James Morone, who is the author of this new book, Republic of Wrath. My daughter found his title extraordinarily amusing because he is the white professor at Brown University. She could not, she read the back of the jacket. I could not get over that. So he is actually the John Hazen White Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at Brown University, which didn't make it any less funny to her. But so his new book is one of the most kind of thought-provoking ones that I've read in a very long time, and comes sort of at a perfect moment as we are we are deep into these conversations about identity and identity politics and partisanship. And James writes about American history through that lens in a way that is at once almost obvious, but also jarring, particularly to people who might be more comfortable thinking about American history along the lines of some type of vulgar Howard Zinn type of approach to politics, where you're looking at a clash of the poor versus the rich, or the haves or the have-nots, or the working class versus the oligarchs or the elites. And what James does shows that the history of American politics, at least through its parties, is actually rooted in these debates over who we are, over identity, and particularly turning on issues of national origin, race, and gender, and obviously later, sexual identity and sexual orientation. So I wanted to just give people a foundation of what argument the book is making, what story the book is telling, and maybe we can start all the way, back in right around the Revolutionary period with the Federalist Party versus, I guess, the anti-federalists in identifying how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, that's a great summary of the book you just gave, Brian. So I started to write it kind of naively. I thought, okay, politics has gotten incredibly nasty, partisan. I had a vague sense from studying history that we'd been there before. And so my question was, what's new and what's old? And so I went right back. The very first contested election, where each party named a candidate and they ran against each other, was the election of 1800, as you were just saying. Right. And what struck me as soon as I started it, there were a few things that I thought, oh my gosh, this looks very familiar. And the first thing that struck me was, as you just said, how powerful the question of who are we was. That first election of 1800 is famous because John Adams of the Federalists, his rotundity, they called him, he was a sort of pompous guy. Mm-hmm. He was terrified by immigrants. He thought they would, as he put it, tear us to pieces. And they put the first nativist laws into effect. If some immigrant crossed the line, they were out of here. And all the executive had to do was round them up and ship them home. But what was interesting, and what gets forgotten, is that the Federalists, who are horrible about immigration, even by Trump standards, were really enlightened about race. They made a deal with the slave rebels of Haiti, then it was called Saint-Domingue, and actually sent ships over to help them consolidate their power. Now, the Democrats, who were furious about how ugly the Federalists were being to their friends, the immigrants, and let's just say the immigrants were voting before they got over their seasickness. The Democrats just sent them right to the polls back in 1800. Right. But they said, wait, you can't make a deal with former slaves. What message does that send to our slaves? So notice the crucial thing. On the one hand, one party embraces, or at least is kind of enlightened about race. The other party is enlightened or open to immigration. And the most striking thing I found, starting from then, right to the present, is how for most of American history, the parties split up. the different groups on the margin of power, the different groups pushing in who challenged the establishment, who challenged the old view of who we are. Here come the immigrants. I don't want to. Here come the Catholics. Here come the African Americans. But they were split between the parties. So the parties never really mobilized this gut sense of, wait, it's tribal, us versus them. And that's what's changed in American history. It was a long time coming. But the real story of our partisanship is now all the tribes, all the people on the margins, all the so-called minorities are on one side, and the whites, the anxious whites thinking, what about our status, are on the other side. And that's a huge change.
It's a fascinating story of how we got to where we are today. And just so everybody understands, when we talk about enlightenment, we're talking in relative terms. We're talking about the year 1800. So there's probably nobody there would qualify as anything other than straight canceled in our given our current discourse. But I want to underline what you said about the Federalists striking a deal with the Haitian rebels. So and you know a lot more about this history than I do, but for decades before that, particularly in the Caribbean, there had been routine slave uprisings. We learn a lot about the couple of organized slave uprisings that we had here in the United States. And when you see the small number of them, you start to wonder why it was that the slave owners were so petrified of slave uprisings, and the answer seems to be in the Caribbean, that the Caribbean today is a distinct place to us. It's where we go on vacation and where we watch with pity as hurricanes ravage the area. But back in the the colonial days, there was sort of like one community, like South Carolina, Georgia, and the Caribbean, or North Carolina. They're all kind of part of the same community, and so uprisings that happened in the Caribbean were influencing politics over in the United States heavily. A lot of the slaves from the Caribbean are brought over to the United States. A lot of the slave owners fled the Caribbean, and so you have a successful slave uprising where, inspired by the French Revolution, the Haitians there rise up and take control. And the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, they reach out and offer military support and then cut trade deals, rather than what the later response was. And so that happens like in the context of the 1800 election.
Yes.
And wasn't there also an uprising in Virginia that freaked Democrats out right before the election as well?
Completely. And I should just say, for people who are not all that versed, it was the Federalists versus the Democrats. They call themselves Republicans, but let's just call them Democrats for now, because it's the same party. So the slaves do rebel, as you said, inspired by the French Revolution. And that rebellion essentially goes on throughout the 1790s, because once the slave rebels, and it's incredibly bloody, the slave rebels rise up, the whites try to slaughter them. The English come in and say, well, we'll take over this island. It's a very lucrative island. They fight for 4 years. They lose almost as many men fighting the slave rebels in Haiti as they had lost in the entire American Revolution. They give up after 4 years. Napoleon sends his people in. They try to take it over. So what you have to imagine is waves of slave owners grabbing their slaves and running for the southern United States where they could be safe, while this war goes on for 10 years. And so Haiti, or Saint Domingue as they call it, is just this terror for the Southerners. And they keep saying, when Adams makes the deal, you said Adams wasn't all that enlightened. You're right. He liked the British, hated the French. And the fact that the French were trying to take over this island, the fact that it was an old French possession, he thought, stick it to the French. So that's why he made the deal. But he was willing to make a deal with slave rebels as they started to consolidate their control. As you just said, Ryan, and people forget this, while people are voting in the election of 1800, they discover Gabriel's Rebellion. This was going to be a huge rebellion in Virginia. Now, the Democrats have been saying for 10 years, you're making over and over again, what happened in Haiti could happen here. And they say it again and again. And then when Adams makes his trade deal, they go crazy. Jefferson says this is almost inviting our slaves to rebel. In fact, South Carolina got so nervous about slave rebellion that if a ship came in with black sailors, those sailors had to spend the time in a jail while the ship was loading, unloading, and in dock. And if they sailed away without paying the bounty for keeping that man would be sold into slavery. They really had those screws on tight. And then they discover the biggest slave rebellion in American history. They discovered it just because there was a huge storm and the plan leaked because it had to be put off. Mm-hmm. So people are voting. They're literally in the act of choosing a president. The Democrats are screaming, we told you so. And so the whole issue of slavery that has the Southerners terrified, and they're the base of the Democratic Party, comes sweeping into the American election right there in 1800. So we think identity politics is tough. You read the newspapers in 1800, right. It was just as tough.
Right. So that's how you get Jefferson and the revolution of 1800s and the Democrats coming to power in the 1800s, which eventually kind of breaks the back of the Federalist Party, so much so that, as you write about, John Quincy Adams, when he's later elected for president, runs as a Democratic Republican. He's not even, like, the party has been so shattered that even his son isn't a member of that party. But at that time, you're starting to see a breakup because he beat Andrew Jackson, who, and this is where it gets very confusing for people. He's a Democrat. Andrew Jackson running as a Democrat. John Adams running as a Democratic Republican. Jackson sort of wins the popular vote, right? But then loses out to some corrupt deal. But then comes back and wins 4 years later. So how does everything? How do those issues that you write about of identity shake out through those few decades?
So that's a very interesting issue. The Federalists basically collapse, and their strongest person, Alexander Hamilton, gets into a stupid duel, gets killed. That doesn't help much either. So the election of 1800 is basically the swan song for the Federalists. They never control Congress. They never control the presidency. And after a while, it's basically one party. By the time Monroe is elected, he's running unopposed. So the problem is, at this point, what's essentially happening is they're picking a caucus in Congress is basically picking the presidents. It's not yet a full popular vote. And a guy named Martin Van Buren starts writing letters to the South, and he says, what we really need is a strong party. You see, slavery is getting angrier and angrier. He writes, Van Buren is from New York. He writes, slavery is just beginning to tear our country apart. It's the 1820s, and the Northerners are beginning to get more and more uncomfortable with slavery. He said, if we had a strong party, people would start fighting for their party and forget about all the slavery, non-slavery thing. So the first mass party built in the 1820s by the Democrats was built to unite the North and the South and put aside the issue of slavery. People don't know that. The first party was built to kind of hush the slavery issue by the Northerners. He got together with Calhoun from South Carolina. There he is in New York. And they put up a hero, Andy Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but the popular vote wasn't what really elected presidents. It was the caucus in Congress, because the Constitution does say if no one wins a majority of the popular vote, then Congress decides. And that was par for the course in the 1820s. These guys who built the party said, no, we're going to put up a hero, make it popular election. And people worried about winning elections and getting jobs from the federal government, that's going to take the place of the slavery debate. And so, again, a very unexpected, I didn't know this, that they built the first party, the Northerners and the Southerners together, in order to quiet the slave debate. And here's another thing people will find surprising. That party, that is the true Democratic Party running Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a slaveholder. This was the party of white supremacy. So the Democrats, when you think of Democrats, up till the 1930s, you think of the party of white supremacy. They were always thinking, oh my, what's happening in the Caribbean, that's a warning to us. So keep those chains on slavery. They were so in your face about their politics that their opponents sprung up just to oppose Andrew Jackson, who wins the election as a popular hero. They were called the Whigs. They're really the forerunners of the Republican Party. And they call themselves Whigs because that was the party in England that fought against the monarchy. And they thought, King Andrew Jackson, we need to fight against him. And so by the 1830s, you have the Democrats, the party of white supremacy based in the South, and the pre-Republicans, think of them, the Whigs, who are really based in New England and combine both conservatives who believe in an early form of capitalism and the early abolitionists. So they had a hard time keeping their party together. They will eventually become the Republican Party in 1856. So Jackson is a central figure because they put him up, but this was a great surprise. We built our parties around the race issue right from the start, around the slavery issue. You cannot underestimate how important race and slavery was in the first 200 years of American history. Just can't. It's so powerful.
Yeah, and Martin Van Buren feels like a Karl Rove type, like an kind of operative who is moving the chess pieces around to, almost nihilistically for power. And it's so, let me make sure I've got this right here, so the first major party in the United States is constructed for the express intentional purpose of smothering the question of the morality of slavery beneath these partisan conflicts. And then the rise of partisanship then creates negative partisanship, just the way that you have Trumpers and anti-Trumpers, you have Jackson, and then the people who hate are only united by their hatred of Jackson. And so, which then gets us into William Henry Harrison, which I thought was another fascinating part of your book. So people don't think much about him because he lasted about a month. After his inauguration, but he was the first candidate ever who held campaign rallies. People might assume that candidates had always done that. He almost does it accidentally. He's like traveling through Ohio. He stops in a town. There are people outside his hotel. Correct me if I'm wrong here. He sees them. He speaks to them. They love it. And he says, wait a minute, why don't I do this again? He winds up speaking before 30,000, maybe even, I think you might have said 100,000 people come together at one point at a time when the population of the United States, depending on who you're counting, is about 20 million people. So this is just an absurdly large movement that he's building. And for the first time, women get involved. They're organizing rallies, they're supporting rallies, they're hosting people in their homes, they're even speaking at events. The Whigs tolerate this. Some Whigs seem to appreciate it, others kind of tolerate it, whereas the Democrats say this is the end of the world. This is what you'll get if you go with the Whigs and you abandon the patriarchal white supremacy that we stand for. And so you begin to see the parties dividing along lines of gender. Harrison wins, but he had an anti-Trumper, an anti-Jacksonian, who didn't agree with him on anything except that he didn't like Jackson. Was it Polk? Was his
Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Right.
Right. This Democrat who was his cousin, hilariously, but they're not terribly close. So Harrison dies. The abolitionists think that he was assassinated by the slave power. Tyler takes over and kind of flips power back to not exactly to the Democrats, because he had left the Democratic Party, but then you wind up with Democrats, back in control. So, was kind of what Fremont and Lincoln and the Republican Party, are they the ones who inherit this movement? Because
Yes.
maybe Harrison could be described as a first movement candidate.
Yes. That you could say that. The thing about 1840 is it's the first time two mass campaigns, and they're just, as you were saying, a huge number of people get involved. They really took the idea.
Oh, and let me stop you before you get too far, because people are going to hear a lot about 1840 probably on election night, right? Because that set the record for turnout.
Yeah.
We may have the second highest, and so if you want to impress your friends, whenever the hosts say it's the second highest turnout, you can say, you know what was the first? 1840. So go ahead.
So far, 1840, 1860, and 1876, all big debates over slavery. But that's right, it was huge turnout, and it's usually thought to be just all fluff. By the way, the Tippecanoe people, the Whigs, had this huge leather ball that they rolled from town to town across Ohio with Harrison slogans on it. And people saw that ball and they would shout, "Keep the ball rolling." That's where we get that expression. It is also said that his opponent was Martin Van Buren, was known as Old Kinderhook, or OK. And so the opponents yelled OK in response to keep the ball rolling, a little slang that comes in. But this was like an evangelical campaign. You weren't supposed to campaign then, and we don't really call these guys explicitly campaigning, but Harrison gave some speeches that were incredibly attended. There's one in Dayton, Ohio, that's famous, and people probably exaggerated the number of folks that were there, but it was a huge rally. People came back so excited, saying, "We will remember this to our dying day." And women began to get involved. There was a loophole in the male supremacy. Everybody knew men were politics and markets, and women were religion and morals, the domestic sphere. They took care of the family. They took care of the pets. But there was a loophole in here. You see, abolition, they thought slavery was a sin. And the part of the Whigs were on the abolition side. They hated slavery. And women came to them and said, well, as people who have a higher understanding of morality, we have to fight slavery. And a lot of the Whigs said, well, yeah, I guess that's right. Martin Van Buren.
Follows.
Yeah, it follows. And so they started organizing. They started giving speeches. And the Democrats said, whoa, what? Wait, women giving speeches. For a woman to talk in a church is a crime. They said, quoting St. Paul. But the Whigs were kind of torn about this. They said, well, they are of a higher morality than we men. So I guess on the issue of slavery, they should be talking. And so women come into politics, but notice it's all still split up. The abolitionists are in with the Whigs, future Republicans. The women who get involved, they're in with the Whigs, but the Democrats are the party of immigrants. We've got a big immigrant wave, lots of Irish coming in. They sign up with the Democrats and they hate the Whigs. They beat them up when they find them in New York City. You think what another memory that might come in a couple of weeks is these groups of immigrant Democrats walking around beating up the sorry Whigs who are for abolition. So once again, you have all these different identities roiling in this election of 1840. Harrison wins.
Right.
He gives the most boring speech ever for his inauguration and dies a month later. And as you said, John Tyler comes in and he's a Democrat and a slaveholder, and he wants to return power to the Democrats. let me just say one more thing about that,
Mm-hmm.
if I can. Tyler needs an issue to win. He wants to get reelected, and he wants to run. And he figures he comes up with the issue that will destroy the Democratic Party. Right now, we have the anti-slavery factions in the North and the Midwest, obviously the slavery faction in the South. What Tyler says is let's annex Texas, which is in the process of rebelling. Well, the problem with annexing Texas is that is likely to bring in a whole bunch of slave states. The way he pushes the annexation of Texas through is to say, you Whigs, you are the party of old, tired America. We Democrats are the party of manifest destiny. We're going to go running right to the coast. Of course, we're going to annex Texas. And after that, we're going to annex the Northwest. Well, the Democrats had kept their coalition, North and South, together by saying, hey, it's states' rights. If you don't want slavery, that's fine. If you want slavery, it's up to you. Even radical Democrats agreed with that. But now, by throwing manifest destiny into the mix, the Democrats raised the question, well, what about the West? And Northern Democrats, they wanted land in the West. And the Southern Democrats, they wanted land in the West for slavery. And that began to split the Democrats apart. Tyler is the bad guy by annexing Texas. And I'm sorry to our friends in Texas, now a swing state all of a sudden. But it was the possibility of slavery in the West that really created a division in the Democrats' ranks and inspired eventually the Republican Party to form up on the ashes of the Whigs, who just couldn't get their northern and southern flanks together. And the northern Whigs became Republicans, and they said, no slavery in any territories. Where slavery is, fine. It can continue to exist, but no slavery out West. And the Democrats didn't quite know what to do about that, because Northern Democrats wanted land out West. Southern Democrats wanted land for slavery. And so that blows up the Democratic Party, thanks in part, and I hope we have a chance to talk about this, Ryan, thanks in part to the Supreme Court overreaching and trying to solve a hot political issue in 1857.
And before we get to that, in the middle, you've got the American Party, the know-nothings. And so this surge of immigration that is benefiting the Democratic Party is also producing a backlash among the kind of Protestant native-born, at least Northerners. I don't know, how significant that backlash was. I'm curious in the South, but it creates, as the Whigs collapse, into the void comes this know-nothing party, which, like in what 1854 or 52, swept basically all of Massachusetts, like wins the entire legislature and pretty much every seat, the most incredible kind of dominance that you could ever imagine. And they want to strip citizenship, and they're very Donald Trump on steroids in the 1850s, and Republicans or Whigs like Lincoln kind of watch it nervously, because some opportunistically try to harness that energy. Others say, no, let's let this burn out and see if we can grab onto it so that we can bring the issue away from immigration back to free soil, issues of race and slavery. And so, how were all Democrats pro-immigrant, or did they also fall victim to some of that xenophobia that surged in the 1850s?
Great question. And this is really one of those fascinating moments, and again helps the through line of the whole American history, and that is the division of the different groups on the side. So the Whigs they include the anti-slavery party. As they collapse, and they collapse because the Southern Whigs are pro-slavery, the Northern Whigs include abolitionists. You can't have that party. It's not going to work. And so they split up. And here's the really fascinating thing. Who's going to replace the Whigs? As you just said, Ryan, in the 1850s, you've got two different factions that emerge. One faction is from the Whigs, from the Conservative Party, is the We Hate Immigrants Party. And if you've been listening to some of Donald Trump's rhetoric, multiply it by 3 and you have the nativists. They call themselves Know Nothing. They call themselves later the American Party, and they met astonishing success. They swept Massachusetts. They swept lots of governorships. They swept all the elected offices in California from coast to coast. The We Hate Immigrants was a major force in the particularly in the midterm of 1854. And as you said, some Whigs leapt in. Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania thought, all right, I'm gonna surf this anti-immigrant wave right into the presidency. But there was another half to the Whig party, and they formed an anti-slavery party. So you have to imagine the 1850s, which was the last time we constructed a new party. One faction hated slavery, and all they wanted to do was make sure there wasn't any slavery in the new territories. There's a civil war going on in Kansas right now, and they're just crazy about that. One of the members of this party, a great preacher named Beecher, Harry Beecher Stowe's brother from Brooklyn, said there's more faith in a rifle, in a new modern Springfield rifle, than there is in a Bible. And so the new rifles that they were shipping into Kansas for the Civil War between slave and free were called Beecher Bibles, those guns. So
they funded people to go there, right? And
they got immigrants to go there because Congress had just said, well, you decide whether you want to be slave or free. And there were election after election, and it was fought with guns and knives, as well as votes and lots of cheating. But so you just imagine the anti-slavery people fighting the anti-immigrant people for control of that, what became the Republican Party. The Democrats, by and large, were pro-slavery, pro-white supremacy. Not all. There were some Northern Democrats who weren't, but the Northern Democrats didn't like the idea of it moving west, but they just said states' rights. But by and large, the Democrats were the party of immigration. So notice once again how we split up these diversity issues, these identity issues. If you hated immigrants, you were a Republican. If you hated slavery, you were a Republican. So we each party spoke for a different group on the side. If you were for women's rights, you were a Republican. But if you were standing for immigrants, if you were saying those Republicans will squash the immigrants, then you were definitely a Democrat. It wasn't completely cut and dry, but that's a pretty good approximation of what happens going into the 1860s and the incredible election of Abraham Lincoln. But the anti-slavery forces consolidate control by the election of 1856. The Know-Nothings are incredible, and then all of a sudden they disappear. And they disappear for the same reason, that slavery just drowns everything out. So the Northern Know-Nothings, known as the North Americans, they don't much like slavery. And the Southern Americans, they want to protect slavery. And so that crushes the Know-Nothing party. But boy, the anti-immigrant sentiment, which you can see in 1800 among the Federalists, is still going strong in the Conservative Party. And the dirty, rotten secret is, though Abraham Lincoln never went for any Know-Nothing vote, he was opposed to them, he wrote letters denouncing them, but he never went public. He kept it quiet. And his idea was, hopefully they'll burn themselves out. He was an incredibly shrewd politician, and he was exactly right. It burned themselves out, but insofar as anti-immigrant sentiment still existed, it crawled into the coalition with the Republicans that would win the 1860 election.
All right, so then 1856, Dred Scott, which you alluded to earlier. This is the Supreme Court overreach where Dred Scott, apparently that wasn't his name. They even botched his name.
Yeah,
Sanford. How much respect
Sanford,
they had for him.
Yeah, it's a typo. Dred Scott versus Sanford. They actually misspell the name of the slave owner family.
Right. The slave owner. Yeah. And so essentially, he's brought to a free state by his owner Then they return. His owner dies. He sues and says, the law is once free, always free. I was on free soil. I'm now free. Supreme Court takes this case up, and with some collusion with Buchanan, comes to a almost unanimous or 7-2, like
7-2. Yes, exactly.
A 7-2 verdict that says no. In fact, Dred Scott cannot sue. He's the property of this slave owner, and he is and always will be. And essentially, the entire Republican Party platform is illegal and is unconstitutional. And it doesn't take much legal reasoning to go from there to say, well, if this is what your view of the Constitution is, then slavery is effectively legal everywhere in the United States. And the Republicans respond by saying, well, then, you know what? The Supreme Court's illegal, more or less, that we don't respect this court. They start mocking the justices, calling them fat and stupid, and politicizing the court in a way that it hadn't been in a long time. In the 56 campaign, you had, that's the first Republican candidate, Fremont, who's kind of a celebrity, who then has an even more famous wife who galvanizes women into that election in a way they hadn't been since Harrison. It becomes a real cause. They lose. Buchanan, our first gay president, it appears, is largely considered the worst president ever. Doesn't bother running for re-election, and finally the Republicans, looking at the 1856 vote count, say, if we combine, Millard Fillmore had run, right, as a free soiler in 56. We combine those votes with the votes that Fremont got, then we can actually cobble together a majority across the border states. They nominate Lincoln, who's the kind of moderate choice at that point. He wins, and then ironically, I guess all these Irish immigrants enlist or are drafted into the Union to then fight against the party that had ridden to power for so long on their backs. And so again, you have the parties kind of dividing on immigration on the one hand, women's rights, and pro or anti-slavery on the other side. How does that unfold after the Civil War? Because the Republican Party is not only built on to eradicate slavery, it also is the party of a lot of wealthy merchants and other business people which is the only way that you can understand how quickly the Republican Party moves away from its support of civil rights and rights for the freed slaves and toward this kind of corrupt party that we come to know in the late 19th century.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let me just say a word, because it's so relevant with the Amy Coney Barrett selection about that overreach with Dred Scott. I mean, you described it well, Ryan, but you have to imagine the inauguration of James Buchanan. He gets up there. He has been squeezing arms in the Supreme Court to solve the slavery issue once and for all on behalf, as you say, of the slavery people. And he gets up in his inaugural address and he says, we had a big contest for the presidency, but as soon as the results were announced, everybody agreed. Well, that's what's going to happen now with the Supreme Court. They're going to rule on slavery, and I, like all my countrymen, will agree with what they say. And 3 days later, they come out with this incredible decision that simply says all the compromises people have been trying to make, like draw a line at the 3630 parallel and everything north is free soil and everything south is slavery, or let the people vote, all those compromises are unconstitutional. African Americans have no rights under the US Constitution, period, full stop. Well, wait, the Republican Party is saying no slavery in the territories. The Supreme Court is saying always slavery in the territory. So it is a message basically to disband. And as you just said, it completely delegitimized the Supreme Court. And it stands as a lesson. People aren't, I think, paying enough attention. The Republicans immediately start packing the court. It goes up to 10, it goes down to 8 members. For 6 years, there is lots of messing with the court. Lincoln says in his inaugural address, if the court decides things once and for all, we've lost our democracy. It was a direct attack on a court that was seen as overreaching. And it broke the Democrats. The Northern Democrats said, well, we can't tell our people slavery in every single territory because there won't be any land for us. It used to be believed that you couldn't have slaves and free men working on the same area. So it was one or the other. And the Southern Democrats said, what are you giving away what the Supreme Court gave us? So the Democrats ended up running 2 candidates. And as you said, Northern tier, strong Republican, went for Fremont in 1856, goes for Lincoln in 1860. Middle tier, it's going either way. Southern tier, absolutely no of states, absolutely no Republicans. Fremont almost wins, as you just said, without a single vote in south of the Mason-Dixon line. So our politics became obviously incredibly divided to the tune of 800,000 deaths. But notice again, as you were saying, it wasn't all identity. The parties were both split and both wrestling with all the different identity issues, quite in contrast to today, where we've got them just divided. But after the Civil War, Republicans suddenly look up and they say, wait a minute, the South used to count African Americans as 3/5 of a vote. Now that we freed the slaves, or the slaves in some sense freed themselves by running for the Union lines by the hundreds of thousands and forcing Lincoln's hand, now that the slaves have freed themselves, they're going to count as 5/5. If they don't vote, we, the Republican Party, are screwed. So it's a very partisan calculation. We got to protect the slave vote. Now, it included some moralists from New England who said it's just inhumane not to give these people who've worked under horrible conditions of slavery the vote and indeed equality, and included people who are just counting votes. And they said, hey, if African Americans don't vote in the post-Civil War South, we're in trouble as Republicans. The Democrats—
And there was a loophole in there that you highlight that has bedeviled Democrats, ironically, today.
So here's the amazing loophole.
Yeah, go ahead. So
the 14th Amendment comes up. We're going to finally protect the freemen. Democrats are all opposed. Every Democrat votes against it. There's still the party of white supremacy. But the Republicans say, no, let's make sure the African American males get the vote. So the first thing to come up for a vote says, give people the right to vote. No citizen shall be denied the right to vote, period. It got 5 votes in the Senate. So why did it only get 5 votes? Well, here's the problem. Republicans wanted very much to give the former slaves the right to vote, but they were worried. They had a poll tax in New England. They had literacy tests in New England to stop the Irish. And they were afraid a really expansive amendment giving everyone the right to vote would give the Irish a leg up in New England. So the Republicans committed to African Americans, but committed against Irish, built a loophole. They said no person shall be denied the right to vote on the basis of race or former condition of servitude. So if you were a former slave, you could not be denied the right to vote, but it didn't give everybody the right to vote. In California, they're also worried, well, what if Chinamen start voting, as they quote unquote, as they said in the 1870s. So it was the Republicans who put a loophole in their own constitutional amendment. Now they passed a law saying, no, everybody, you can't use literacy tests. But as soon as the Democrats came back into power, consolidating power in the 1890s, they threw those laws out. And immediately the Southerners said, okay, literacy tests. So the loophole, which was put in for nativist purposes, because those Republicans up in Boston didn't want the Irish voting, ended up screwing African Americans by the 1890s. Once the Democrats consolidated control, it's probably hard for most people watching this to get their minds around the idea that the Democrats were a ferocious party of white supremacy. And throughout this period, hated the idea of giving African-American rights. And that the Democrats did want to give them rights, but were tripped up by their own fear of immigrants. And that's what this huge and powerful 14th Amendment, most powerful amendment in the Constitution since the First Amendment, but has this loophole, and I want to go back to that right to vote when we get a chance. But that's the remarkable and forgotten story of the 14th Amendment, the nativist loophole.
And so I can understand it from a partisan perspective. I can understand it from identitarian perspective. I want to tease a little bit of the class dimension out of this. So if Republicans are, simultaneously the party of the nativist working class that wants, free soil, doesn't want to have to compete with unpaid labor, slave labor, they're also, as we talked about, the party of the super rich in New England. And so what is it about the immigrants, Irish immigrants in particular, that so bothered the class interests of the New England rich? Is this about suppressing kind of wage increases that could be demanded if all of these immigrants are able to compete more fairly, or is it just simple nativism? Like what is going on here that the Republicans would undermine their fundamental moral project of expanding the franchise and undermine their own partisan purposes because it allowed Democrats, when they took power in 1890, to effectively strip blacks of the right to vote in the South, which then eliminated their foothold of power there. So why were they willing to risk all of that? For what gain?
So you've really raised a very important issue that becomes particularly striking after the Civil War, the 1860s. We now have a booming industrial economy. The Civil War propelled the economy forward. And you have this very interesting combination. The Republicans, as you said, they're the party of white whiskers and monopoly capital. They're the party of the rich. And the Democrats become the party of the working class, and that includes immigrants. So there is this huge class battle as well. And notice something interesting. It's the wealthy conservative party that is the party of racial, if not equality, at least some protection for African Americans. No one would say racial equality in this period, but it at least say give the African Americans the right to vote. But driving a lot of this is this deep class animosity. And as labor unions form, Republicans become terrified of labor unions as well. Eventually, by the 1890s, the parties all split up on this. The Republicans become almost two parties on the issue of immigration. Some of the capitalists said, no, more, this is great. This keeps down wages, it breaks unions. The more immigrants we have coming in, that's great. And the moralists, the very people who fought the Civil War, were worried that the immigrants would ruin America. They didn't speak our language. They had weird religions. They refused to assimilate. Does all this sound vaguely familiar? They made the exact same arguments then that you're hearing today. So the Republicans split into a faction of business guys who really want immigrants and a faction of moralists, the old abolitionists really, to a large extent, who are afraid that the immigrants will tear America apart. It's the very thing Adams worried about. Right. And across the aisle, the Democrats, the machine politicians are like, no, we love immigrants. They vote for us. And the labor unions start saying, wait, too many immigrants means we have a hard time winning anything, any social welfare policy, any forming unions and so forth. So you had the oddest bedfellows in American history where you had business people, more immigrants, and machine bosses saying more immigrants, and then the moralists and the unions, both, and the labor people both saying, no, keep the immigrants out. And the nativists that keep the immigrants out eventually won. And they made this a moral cause that the immigrants just could not assimilate. If you take the worst things that are said about the Muslims today in terms of the immigration debate, or the Latinx in the immigration debate, that's what they were saying about the Jews, about the Italians, and about the other Catholics coming from, and for the Catholics coming from Poland and Eastern Europe. So by the 1920s, we've just shut down immigration altogether. We've taken one of the great hot issues in American politics and just pulled it out. In the early 1900s, we had over 1 million people landing on American shores. That's more than 1% of the population every year. And by 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt takes the oath of office, it's just a sprinkling of people. I forget what the figure is. It's like 35,000 people landing from ashore. We just shut those gates down. But this time the parties kind of divided in how they felt about immigration.
Right,
and,
which is, yeah. No, you kind of described, go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing about race as well. That's really a great lesson for Democrats. The Republicans no longer needed the black vote by the 1890s because all the Western states came in and they were basically leaning Republican. And so all that trouble in the South, Republicans just said, forget it. There's a wonderful inauguration address given by William Howard Taft. And he begins, very beginning of his address, he's a Republican, he's just won the office, and he said, look, we used to be the party of civil rights, and we used to believe black people should have equality, but it didn't work. Now, I am not a racist myself, but we just have to give up on giving black people jobs, on giving them the vote. It didn't work. And so there are the Republicans, the party of African Americans, basically saying we're going to continue to say we're the party of African Americans, but we're not going to do anything about it. And they stopped in any way defending blacks. But they had an ace in the hole. The Democrats who ruled the South were incredible segregationists, and they dominated the Democratic Party. So if you're an African American voter in 1910, you have a choice between a Republican Party who doesn't care about you and a Democratic Party who is segregationist. As the African Americans moved north in the Great Migration between 1910 and 1960, all of a sudden they can vote, and they're looking around and they're saying, one party ignores us and one party hates us. What are we going to do? And the decision they made, we still live with today.
Right. So what I actually went, because you referenced that Taft inaugural in your book, I went and looked it up and read it. And you're right. It's a really, really fascinating speech because he makes this pragmatic argument that, look, he says, I have no, what do you call them, racial feelings or something like that, which was actually probably unusual for a white person to say at the time. That was considered enlightened, just to say that you don't hate black people. He then goes on to say, not only did it not work, but every time we pushed for civil rights or for the right to vote, there were lynchings, there was violence, and it increased the amount of racism around the country. So better to just leave the whole thing alone. Not just better for everybody, would be better for black people as well. That was his argument for why the enlightened response was to just utterly ignore the black constituents, right? And so you see the black community in the South running into this political dead end, and like you said, they just leave by the millions, and they reshape the politics of the North by leaving. Initially, it's the party of Lincoln, and the party that isn't openly hostile at all times to them is winning their votes in these northern cities. But then the machines, because machines are amoral, machines just want to stay in power. They said, well, wait a minute, there's no reason that we can't win the votes of the black people who've come to our city. If they're here and they're voting, we might as well get them to vote for us. Let's see what we can do to win them over. And I had read somewhere that even though the number of people voting was very small, number of black people voting was very small, that Wilson was the first time that a plurality of black voters went towards Democrats. I think in your book you had said it wasn't until maybe Roosevelt. I'm curious, even though Wilson, as we know, was a proud white supremacist, did he make serious inroads with the black vote because of this migration and this movement that was beginning to shake up? Or what was the kind of what to you was the moment that vote moves from Republican to Democratic?
Yes. And I'll just say one thing about Taft's inaugural address. His predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt, invites Booker T. Washington to the White House for lunch, a very visible identity with a very respectable non-radical African American. And the Southern Democrats go nuts, and they start saying, we will have to lynch 1,000 people. They didn't use the word people, they used the more horrible word, before they'll know their place again. And for 30 years, no president, not till Herbert Hoover, publicly met with an African American. So when Taft said that in his inaugural address, it wasn't as crazy as it reads to us today, exactly as you said. But here, as the African Americans move north, they get the vote. As you said, machine politicians locked in battles for the northern cities start appealing to them. So a whole contingent of African Americans, led by a man named Trotter, support Woodrow Wilson. Even though he's a segregationist, it's not obvious what a big segregation he's going to end up being. And there's a scene in the White House shortly with Wilson as president. Trotter becomes alarmed that Wilson, the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland in 1896, now it's 1913, has started segregating the major departments. They're run by white Southerners, Treasury and Post Office, the two by far the largest departments. And both the secretaries say, okay, we can't, if we have black people working in this department, we might have white women working under the supervision of black men. That's immoral. And Wilson goes, yeah, fine, let's resegregate Washington. So his supporters, a contingent of his supporters come in, and they have a screaming match. Woodrow Wilson, who is always kind of a quiet guy, he starts screaming at Trotter, saying, you are putting your cause back. No one has ever stood in this office and talked to me in the tone you've talked. And Trotter actually got quite excited, saying, look, we voted for you. We came out for you. And now you're segregating the departments. One of the departments said no restaurant in Washington will serve African Americans. Why should the post office mess hall serve them? If they can't eat out, why should they be able to eat in? And so there was once again a rupture. So African Americans begin to move, as you say, towards the Democrats, only to be basically slapped in the face. But the Democrats on the streets in Kansas City, in Chicago, in New York, they're not put off by this. They don't have anything in common with the segregationists who are running their party on the national level. They're just trying to win elections in Kansas City and Chicago and New York and Detroit. And so they start mobilizing the black vote. And you could see it in the black newspapers. The Chicago, in 1932, the next time a Democrat wins an election, the newspapers in Missouri start to once again endorse Roosevelt. The black newspaper in Chicago, the largest daily, the Chicago Defender, you can read their agony, Ryan. The Republicans are hopeless, but we can't have the segregationists. But the Republicans are hopeless. Oh, well, vote for Hoover. That's the best of a bad lot. But a third of the vote in Chicago on the South Side actually goes over. They're so angry at Hoover, and they've been so badly hit by the Depression that they go over to the Democrats. And they start going into the Democratic Party. Roosevelt notices, and he's got the huge problem. The segregationists support me in the South, the solid South, And now the black vote is beginning to support me in the North. And he, master politician that he is, he's juggling both these balls in the air. In 1936, he actually wins the black vote. This is the first time we really have definitive evidence that the black vote goes for the Democrats. Might have been some earlier, but that's in dispute because the data is not as good, or at least I couldn't find definitive data. The media laughs at the African Americans. The newspaper columns, particularly the ones who lean Republican, saying these fools are going into a party of segregation. They're faux friends. It reads a little bit like some Democrats talking about Latinos who are voting for the Republicans. Yeah, how can you vote for them? They hate you. Vote for us even if we're not doing very much for you. But the story is this. In 1936, maybe in 1932, maybe sooner, but clearly in 1936, of the now 2.5 million African Americans who are voting, they go for Roosevelt big time. Still the party of segregation. Roosevelt won't even make a statement against lynching. That's how fearful he is of losing the Southerners. That's the 1936 election. By the 1948 election, Democrats in the White House all along, Roosevelt, then Truman, the setting in the 1948 election finally has a face-off between the rising black vote and the segregationists in this great battle in the 1948, the last convention of the New Deal period. And in that convention, the black vote wins and the white segregationists rise up, march out of the convention, and run a hopeless, inept campaign by the Dixiecrats. And that's the end of the Solid South. So the way to view what happens in the New Deal about identity politics is African Americans rise up, they join a party where they were not welcome on the national level, but very welcome on the local level. Roosevelt trying to play with them and the segregationists. And over the next 12 years, they drove the segregationists right out of the Democratic Party. They won the debate for the soul of the Democratic Party. And the debate will go on really till 1964. From 1948 to 64, Democrats keep trying to juggle both, but you never had the same kind of Solid South. Now the South is in play, and you never had a majority of African Americans voting for Republicans again. The origins of our own time were made by black voters as they took over the Democratic Party and drove the segregationists out of it. And the 1948 convention, that's the cockpit when they had this huge battle. And Harry Truman is like, no, guys, calm down. We don't need a strong civil rights plank. And they overruled him and the party leaders and pushed it through by a very narrow margin. So almost fist fights on the floor. But that's the origins of the black vote going Democratic. It would go 2/3 Democratic in 1948, and then in the 1964 election would become 90% Democratic. But we have to think of the black vote as this great agent that changed the Democratic Party from the party of white supremacy to the party that would more and more support black rights.
Yeah. And then you talk about some of that lingering pro-immigrant sentiment in the Democratic Party kind of manifesting itself in 1965. So not only do you get the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, but you get, without much attention, a landmark immigration reform, which opens the floodgates. Johnson leaves it to the chair to write the legislation, and from some white supremacist impulse, the chair changes the idea. The idea was going to be there will be these different merit classifications, and this is how we'll admit our quotas of immigrants on an annual basis. So that he can stick by some white supremacist principles. He says, well, let's do family reunification, so that therefore a bunch of Europeans will come over here in his deluded mind, because in his mind, America is this beacon of hope and glory. And so who wouldn't want to flood these shores where things are going just fine in Europe? So most Europeans are like, well, no, thank you. Like, there's no potato famine here. There's no 1848, suppression of different revolutions or rebellions. So we're fine here. The people who do want to come to the United States are the people that he was trying to keep out by that phrasing or that writing of the law. And you start seeing a surge of immigration over the next few decades, which then kind of reshapes the parties again. And you wind up with the same Republican Party that you talked about earlier, with a business wing, a chamber of commerce that is heavily pro-immigrant, and then a white working class native wing that is former immigrants, but now they're native, hostile to immigration. And at the same time now, while you have these white college-educated voters trending towards Democrats, which I'm curious if you think of that as an emerging identity almost, you see young Black and young Hispanic voters trending toward Donald Trump this election. More young Black voters are going to vote for Trump this time after everything he's done. And the same with Hispanic voters than in 2016. And I'm wondering if you know what the heck to make of that based on, your reading of the last 200 years. What do the trajectories show us we have in store for us?
Yes, and of course it's Latino males and African-American males who are trending towards Donald Trump.
Yes, but what women too, like less than men, but in that direction.
Yeah. There's one huge lesson when you look at this whole thing over 200 years, and that is that identity politics never stay still. In fact, our politics never stay still. We tend to process politics in 2-year stanzas. So we look back at the last election, we look forward to the next election, and that's about as far as we look. But groups are always moving, they're always shifting, they're always changing. And parties that take groups for granted lose them. And parties that reach out to groups win them. And that is the great lesson of all history. Now, what happened with that's an amazing story. It's like that 1965 immigration law, which, as you said, just went through very quietly. No one cared. Immigration had been closed down in the United States from basically 1921 to 1965. So it's just everybody's grandfathers. They were all assimilated, grandmothers. And they just very casually reopened it. But they reopened it in a civil rights framework. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, says, we want to bring our immigration laws into sync with our civil rights laws. For the first time, immigration is viewed as a civil rights issue. And as you say, Feinbaum, the guy who's chair of the committee in the House, he rewrites it because he thinks all the Irish will come flooding over, but wrong. The Irish were perfectly happy, as you say. But the idea that identity is ever cast in stone is the great mistake parties have always made. So people have been saying throughout this election, it's interesting that Joe Biden seems to have a harder time, still getting 2/3, but a harder time than previous Democrats getting the Latino vote. Meanwhile, if you want to think of the immigrant vote, what you think of is starting in 1970, you have millions of people coming over, 59 million people between 1970 and the present time, huge number. And little by little, they are driven into the Democratic Party. The Asian vote went for Republicans. It went for Republicans big in 1992. They went for Bob Dole. Bob Dole by 5 points beats Bill Clinton. No groups went for Bob Dole practically. But the Asian vote went for him. And then after 9/11, the Republicans just became so ferocious and were not very careful about not targeting Asian Americans in their war on terror. I remember walking through an airport, and I was walking with a friend of mine who was a South Asian his family was from India. And I said, let's dash, we'll miss the plane. And he touched me by the arm and he said, you dash. Brown people can't dash through airports anymore, Jim. And I just thought, oh my gosh, what's happening to our politics? But Republican strategy drove the immigrant groups into the Democratic Party. And the question you ask is, what have Democrats delivered to all these groups to have such a lock, at least in recent elections, on all the immigrant groups? But if you remember, it's always changing. It's not shocking. People are saying, well, how could an African American vote for a Republican? You have to look at what each party is saying, is offering, is giving to a group that's never solid, never all one thing. So it's always changing. And if someone wants to take an extreme case of how things are changing, just go back a generation and look at the Michael Dukakis election. Just go look at a map. If you just want to see, just open your mind to how things change. So Michael Dukakis knew that he was going to win West Virginia. Sure enough, took it easy. West Virginia was always Democratic. But he knew he'd lose California. In 8 out of the last 9 presidential election, California went Republican. Red California, blue West Virginia. Well, it's unimaginable now. They're all the way at the other end. So one of the great stories is these identity politics just keep changing. What we went into, as I said at the start of the program, is this crazy situation where at this moment still, African Americans, more and more women, and almost every immigrant group, varying from 60% to 80% for Asians, are in the Democratic coalition. All the so-called minorities, what makes a majority now, in the Democratic coalition. And Republicans have fallen in to being the party of whiteness. This is a really interesting story, and it's not played up enough, Ryan, I don't think. But between 1964 and 1968, the Republicans discovered that as the civil rights movement went into the Democratic Party, they could be the party of white people. Wallace showed them, Goldwater showed them, Nixon cashed in. From that time on, if you average out between 1972 and 2016, the Democrats got 39% of the white vote. Went up and down, of course. Republicans became the party of white people. Now, at first, what that meant was they were on the presidency level, they're the majority. Between 1968 and 1992, you had the biggest set of electoral college landslides in American history. Why? Whites were voting, on average, 61% for whites. There weren't enough of other people. 12% African Americans, fewer of immigrants. As the immigrant population, so the Republicans, they didn't have to do anything to get the white vote anymore. It had fled to them. And so there was the occasional wink, the occasional dog whistle, but it was easy for them. After 1992, it got harder. They had to scream a little bit more. Now you had the Willie Horton ads, and to get that extra white vote as the white vote declined, all of a sudden the Democrats became competitive because now the white vote is not the vast majority. It's not 90% anymore. We still are in a situation where the Republican Party is 89%. 89% of the people voting Republican are white, and it's under 60%. It's a falling group in the Democratic Party. But what used to be done with little winks, you don't have to say much to get that white vote, got harder and harder. By 2012, the Republican elite understood we've got to get some of these groups. We're a shrinking minority. What Donald Trump figured out was I can squeeze those last white identity votes into my coalition. And now, incredibly enough, he's doubling down on that, trying to get those last white votes. But that's a losing proposition. And the question for the future is, how will each party make its new coalition? And the Republicans will have to win back some of the people they've lost if they're going to be a growing concern. With an asterisk there, just look at Congress right now. The Republican caucus in the House, 89% white male. The Democratic caucus in the House, 39% white male. I mean, they just two different images of America. But as you said, in this election, there are intimations of change. And if you try to imagine where all these groups are going to be, not 2 years from now, but 20 years from now, that really opens up your mind to the different possibilities.
So, no, go ahead.
I was going to say one other theme we haven't mentioned, Ryan, but to me, it's like the blockbuster theme. The other thing that surprised me, and I'll come back in a second, but let me just stretch back to 1800 for 1 second. You mentioned this, but I think it's worth underscoring. When the guys wrote the Constitution, I guess that's a little disrespectful. When the founders wrote the Constitution, they couldn't figure out what to do about voting, so they punted. What amazed me when I started reading the newspapers and reading the election of 1800 was they punted to the states. The states get to decide time, place, and manner, and they all started to change the rules. The states up north changed the rules to help John Adams. Even Jefferson's always you have to reflect the people. You have to reflect the people, which means the Electoral College should be split up. Every district should elect its own elector. And then he thinks, wait, now I'm running. I'm going to lose an elector to John Adams. And so he writes to Monroe and he says, I know I've always been for splitting up the Electoral College, but no, let's make it winner take all. So I get all of Virginia's electoral votes. 6 out of 17 states changed the rules. And here's the story. We've never had rules for how you vote. It's always been up for grabs. The Supreme Court has been quite right when it says in Bush v. Gore, there is no right to vote in the Constitution. Now, they only said that 5-4, but I think the 5 were actually right. There is no right to vote. We might have had it in the 14th Amendment, but again, they didn't put it in. So that means not only do we have all the identity politics we've been talking about, we have this endless battle about who votes and how easily. And that too has been identified with the two parties. Democrats are now the party of let everyone vote, and Republicans are no, let's suppress the vote. Let's make it a little harder. Donald Trump has been remarkably candid, fresh and candid, you'd have to say, about how big turnout hurts Republicans. Here's the real danger that I see. Republicans have a huge choice. They can become the kind of party they were, a bigger tent party. That means they'll have to enlarge their base beyond the anxious white people. Some signs, clearly some Republicans keen to do that. Or they can double and triple and quadruple down on trying to suppress the vote. There's lots of ways to do that. And they now have a court that I think pretty clearly, or at least I would predict, will allow them to do that. So in that sense, something that's always been a problem in American history, the right to vote, is now up for grabs in a dramatic way. And insofar as we say, stay tribal, insofar as the us and them is whiteness versus everyone else, that whole question about voting rights becomes really dangerous. I think we're in a very dangerous moment in American history. We've been there before, but we are there again, which is the whole issue of who gets to vote and how easily and how hard we make it and whether we count their ballots. Constitution didn't help us on that. No amendment really nails that down. And there is a party, one wing of which wants to stay in power by suppressing votes. And if they get their way, we could have a white people's party hanging on by fighting, suppressing votes, throwing out ballots, enabled by a Supreme Court that is not reading the Constitution incorrectly. The Constitution doesn't protect this. It never has. But now that we have the parties really mainstreaming the tribalism, us versus them, there's no division really now. It's all the different so-called minority groups against whiteness. I'm pretty sure that'll change. As you were just saying a little while ago, the white vote is itself changing, the educated white vote going right in to the Democratic Party now, because they don't want to be in the party of races. So it's all changing. But the question is, will those changes, which will be healthy, will they take place in time to save our electoral system? And the obvious question is, what do you think? And I think if you study history, you see we had a lot of tough knocks, and it's hard not to be an optimist when you study history. We just keep getting back up after punching ourselves in the face over and over again. So I guess I am optimistic, but it is one of those moments, and we get to decide our future. And so I'll be watching the week after the election with great trepidation, because we don't have guardrails around our democracy. And if one party on the state level in Florida and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin decide that staying in power is more important than democracy itself, we could have a very dark time, I think.
And it will also be interesting to see if Democrats don't learn from the Republican mistake of 100 years ago of taking the black vote for granted, and if Joe Biden does win this election, that they say, well, guess we've got this under control, and just put themselves on autopilot. But so the book for people, again, and we'll put the link in the video, Republic of Wrath: How American Politics Turned Tribal, from George Washington to Donald Trump, by James Morone. It's just a terrific book. I recommend it to everybody who's watching. You'll enjoy it. Any last words for people?
Well, I think I'll just say one last thing about this election itself. There are a whole lot of Republicans who are saying we've gone too far. We are going to vote for Biden because we've got to blow up the current Republican Party as it's now constituted. Lincoln Project getting under Trump's skin and so forth. All those groups. Well, I've got bad news for them. Simply voting for one more Democrat, as with voting for Obama, is not going to change the base of the Republican Party. If they really want to change the base, they should join the Democrats, make elections easy, make sure that everyone votes. And then the now fervent bases in both parties will have to speak to the people on the sidelines. There's lots of people who lean Republican for all kinds of reasons, who now aren't bothering to vote, aren't quite sure what they're doing. If the fervent Trump base had to speak to them, all of a sudden the Republican Party base would change. And of course it's all changing. You could see all kinds of changes in our identity politics, but first that base has to change. So my message to the Lincoln Project is make it easy for people to vote, and watch. You just watch that Republican Party change right out from under what it's been. Barack Obama, I love Barack Obama, but he kind of took the immigrants for granted. He tried, but he waited till after the 2016 election because there were a few whites in the South, white senators in the South they told him, please don't make any big, bold moves. And many immigrants were, well, what about us? He kept taking a cautious position. And as you said, there's a message of how the Republicans lost great swaths of their constituency. That message should ring loud and clear for Democrats, but first for both parties. Expand the right to vote. It's in all your interests, all our interests. And the next few years are going to be pretty crucial for that.
Well, we'll see if they listen. James Morone, thanks so much for joining us on the conversation.
Ryan, thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.